Sunday of Christmas, we celebrate the light of Christ. If you're sitting in the light of the sun today, you'll be celebrating the light of the sun. Maybe at the passing of the peace, we'll bring the blinds down to protect the rest of us, because it's going to make its way around. I'm glad to be with you here in worship today, gathered with you as we think again of God with us, God in us and through us in the world, encouraging us, walking with us in our lives. Help me, will you, as we call each other to this awareness with the call to worship. I'll do my part and then you do yours. Hope has come,
awakening us to new possibilities.
Peace has come,
inviting us to become agents of reconciliation.
Joy has come,
turning our hearts from fear to wonder.
Love has come,
transforming our lives, transforming our world.
We have come,
amazed by God's grace, to worship the newborn King.
Bethlehem, I story of our lives is like a dance in a way. And there's a period of our lives where we're invited and they repeat like cycles over and over again. That is where we're called to let the Lord lead. Where we're called to let God lead in the dance of our lives. From the time we're children, we're raised to take charge of our lives, to be responsible, to do what we need to do. But there are these important moments where we need to let go and let God. Time for a prayer of confession is a leading into that part of the dance. It's letting God hear the honesty of our lives, the brokenness sometimes of our lives, the hurt that others have caused, and an acknowledgement that we too. When the Spirit talks to us just right, we know our part in the mess. We do. And as we own it and claim it, we lean further into God walking with us in this life. Remembering that our life does not depend upon us, ultimately. It depends upon God, God's mercy, God's grace. Will you pray with me? Will you offer these words with the others gathered here? It's one thing to pray a prayer of confession when you're by yourself. But here we acknowledge it is our human condition that we confess to God. Will you pray with me? Holy God, you are the light of the world, yet too often we shroud your light with indifference. There is much we must confess. When we turn a blind eye to suffering, forgive us. When we are silent in the face of injustice, forgive us. When we choose comfort over compassion, forgive us. When we neglect to offer grace and love, forgive us. Gracious God, you entered into our broken world and made a home among the desperate and despairing. Give us eyes to see you in the face of those whose vulnerability frightens us. Give us the will to care for our neighbors in need. Illumine the shadows of our lives with your light, which is the most persistent darkness cannot overcome. Open our hearts to receive your grace. There are lots of critics of technology in our world today. And one of the criticisms of things like Facebook and Instagram is that when you look at other people's online posts, you only ever see the prepared picture that they made for themselves. You see people looking fine and wonderful, and everything is just great and marvelous. And you can begin to do that thing that they talk about in AA recovery, which is so important, and that is, don't compare your inside inventory to someone else's outside inventory. In the time of prayer of confession, we are invited to do the inside inventory. And to remember that as we do, not to be frightened. Because inside we're all human. We all have hurts and needs and wants, and we all push them away because we don't want to deal with them any more than anybody else does. But in the house of God, in the place of gathering, there's an invitation to let down our guard, to be better known to each other. and to deal with the brokenness, the heartache, the failures that we believe we have involved in. This is why, from the time we were born, in many traditions, before we can talk or walk, the water of God's grace is applied. And if it didn't happen then, maybe in your life it happened at a later point when you're going through a period of growth. When you were baptized and reminded that God's grace is for you. Maybe you're wanting to be baptized. You should always speak to the pastor about that. It's a powerful sign of God's grace in life, and you can carry it strongly in your life, knowing that your life, your salvation, is not up to you. It comes to you because God's water flows to us like a river from heaven. Forgiveness, my friends, is the pathway to full life. Release for others and for yourself is life, signed and sealed in the sound, in the touch, and the feel of the water. Friends, believe the good news of the gospel. In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. Let's stand and sing. From the center of God's will for human beings and for the earth and for the creatures of the earth, there is a longing and a desire that we would be able to live at peace, in harmony, in balance with everything that is around us. But from the beginning, we have experienced the brokenness of our relationships to each other, to the world, to nature, and to God. And in all of that, we see and hear in the message of Jesus that God comes to stand in the breach, to reconcile us to each other, to bring us to a place of peace, of wholeness that is not pretend, but that is real. Friend, my prayer for you on this Christmas Sunday, and I know it's your prayer for me, is that the coming of Christ 2,000 years ago will be just one piece of what accomplishes that peace in our lives today. May the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all.
And also with you.
Now will you be ministers of that peace and turn and offer a sign one to another of God's grace.
Sure.
Peace be with you. Thank you. I know. He is Ron. I love it.
How are you?
I will recount the gracious deeds of the Lord, the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, because of all that the Lord has done for us and the great favor to the house of Israel, that he has shown them according to his mercy, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he said, surely they are my people, children who will not deal falsely. And he became their Savior in all their distress. It was no messenger angel, but his presence that saved them. In his love and in his pity, he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old. Hear the word is saying. Thanks be to God.
Bye.
How was Christmas? Was it good? See, how long ago was it? It was only a couple days ago, right? Right? Yeah, and New Year's is coming. So I've been using these sort of figures up here. I've been using these figures up here to remind us, you and me, of this story of the birth of Jesus. And I think we said a couple times that these three guys here, right, they don't really belong in the story yet. You know that, right? These are representative of the kings that came from faraway lands to see Jesus. And we're going to tell the story of these kings and their visit to Jesus in a wonderful musical play called Amal and the Night Visitors. And I'm hoping that you will convince, plead, and beg your parents to come and see this story. We're going to be telling it on Saturday night, next Saturday night at 7:30. There'll be music and theater lights and actors and wonderful things telling the story of the visit of these magi to come to the house where Jesus was born. Yes. You saw it in a movie. Did you like it? Are you ready to see it again? Say yes, Pastor Lewis. Say yes, yes. What? Your sister's birthday was yesterday? And your mom's were on the same day? Oh. Well, happy birthday. Christmas is a great time to talk about birthdays, although, Mom, your birthday never plays that big when it's right near Christmas, right? It's always shadowed. But still, happy birthday to you. And happy birthday to you. So, Saturday night at 7:30 and Sunday night at 5:30, the wonderful story of these characters, these people who came from far, far away to see Jesus. And the story gets a little confused because we read it in 3 different kinds of books. But today, I want to tell you something else about the story. You know that we had Mary and Joseph who were traveling before Jesus was born, right? And they were in different parts of the building, and they came, and then Christmas Eve they were here, and there's a little baby here now who's with them, right? Now, yes, that's true. Did you know what happens next? Sometimes we only tell the story to a certain point, and I'm not talking about the kings coming, but do you know what happens next? Now that Mary and Joseph have the baby, and they have him in Bethlehem, what happens next? You raise your hand. Do you know? Oh. Wow. That's not just something like that. That's exactly what happens next. He said, correct me if I'm wrong, he said, well, I think there was a king or something who thought that Jesus might grow to be too powerful, and so threatened to kill Jesus, right? And so Mary and Joseph, having traveled all the way to Bethlehem, having the baby, they got packed up, they took the baby, and they had to run for their lives. They had to run for their lives. Because Herod, who was the king, and by the way, he wasn't a foreign king, he was the king of these people. He was Jewish. He was a member of their clan, their tribe. But he was, I wish I had given you the microphone when you were saying it, he felt threatened by Jesus. By the news of the birth of Jesus, he felt threatened. She said, he was threatened, so he threatened Jesus. And not only, in Matthew's gospel, which we're going to read about, not only did he threaten Jesus, but he didn't know exactly where Jesus was. So you know what he did? What? He did. He sent the wise men to go and try to find him, and that was a part of his trick, right? But what happened? Did they tell where Jesus was? No, they didn't. When they left, after having arrived at where Jesus was, they headed home another way, and they did not tell Herod where Jesus was. Did they end up going back to Herod? No, not in the story. But something did happen next, and that is Herod realized they should have been back by now. They should have been here to tell me where the baby is. And he was furious and now really frightened. And so he made a really, really awful decree. He said, well, I don't know where the baby is exactly, but I know this baby that I'm frightened of was born in Bethlehem. So, I'm going to have all the children in Bethlehem killed. That's what he said. How frightened he was of this baby. And that's why Mary and Joseph decided that in order to save Jesus' life, they were going to run. They were going to leave their country and their home entirely. And they were going to pack up the few things that they had in Bethlehem, and that wasn't even their home. But they were going to pack everything up, and they were going to run in the night. And they were going to go as fast as they could, now with the baby Jesus. And they were running from Herod. The king, the all-powerful king, the one who was in charge of everything, taking advantage of his power to do what? To deal with his fear. His fear. His fear that somehow he was going to lose his power, or he was going to lose his kingdom, and all of it wrapped up in his strange fear of the birth of one child. Quite a story, huh? Quite an event to have happened when you're just born, right? But it's part of why we know and believe that the birth of Jesus isn't just a fairy tale. Because it reminds us of how things are in the world of humans. When people get frightened, they do all kinds of crazy things. It's hard to trust God. It's hard to trust for the future, especially when things are changing. And so Herod becomes an example of how not to treat Jesus. Do you have any questions or comments? What do you think about that part of the story? You're right. They stayed in Egypt until Herod died. And when Herod died, someone sent word to Mary and Joseph and said, we think it's safe to return. And so, you know what they did? They packed their stuff up and thought they were finally going to get to go back home to their own country. But on their way back to their own country, someone got to them. And they said, you know what? Herod is dead, but Herod had a son. And that son may be just as hostile to Jesus as his father was. So, you know what they suggested? They said, maybe you ought to move your home to Nazareth. Nazareth was a little out-of-the-way town where nobody important ever was. And that's what they did. They moved. and they came back to their own country, but they moved to Nazareth, which is where Jesus was raised, and Joseph there was a carpenter and made things for people. Now somebody important lived there. That's exactly right. It was a place that nobody important ever came from. But when Jesus lived there and came from there, now the name of Nazareth, the town, many, many, many people know. Thank you for coming up and sharing the rest of the story with me today. So then it got really messy. Not that it wasn't messy to begin with. Mary being pregnant and not married and all, and Joseph making a decision to protect Mary and to keep her safe and to do not just an honorable thing, but to do a wonderful thing, both for Mary and for Jesus, to travel together with them. The long journey would have been made even harder today by the situation in the world as it exists today. You cannot travel from Mary and Joseph's hometown to Bethlehem today because the way is blocked entirely. Used to be that there were just difficult checkpoints, but now it is blocked. Things got messier. They got messier even than the messiness of the stable and the fact that Jesus was born among the animals, which today is appalling to us, but actually I think, in my own little fairy tale mind, I imagine that actually what was going on was that people had a greater sense of their bondedness to animals. They lived more with the animals. In fact, in the wintertime, the animals were invited into the homes because the animals generate tremendous amount of body heat. And for that, the humans were grateful. In fact, many times the children would lay down next to the animals, and in that nurture of the animal's warming body, you could feel a heat that would make you just feel like you were the king of the world. It was one of my favorite parts of going to the barn in the wintertime. There wasn't much that was really favorite about it, especially when there was snow on the ground. But what the amazing thing was that in the farms, the way I went to them, they lined the cows up like in herringbone parking to be milked. And when you had to milk them, you had to go in between them. And when you pushed in between them on really, really cold days, you could push in between the cows and get down to put the milker on. And when you put the milkers on, the cows would lean into you. And you could actually, if you got in the right place, you could pick your feet up and they would hold you up. But what was amazing was their body temperature was so incredibly warm. It was such a good feeling to be held in the cradle of these creatures, these great God creatures. And so when I think about the manger, and the city people say, ooh, I don't know, I don't say so much ooh. I think, wow. It's amazing that in their understanding of the birth of Jesus, that the birth of Jesus wasn't just celebrated by humans. It was celebrated with the word of grace coming, that all of the earth could breathe a sigh of relief. That love and understanding was coming into the world. But if that wasn't messy enough, it got even messier in the story. And it's wonderful to know that children know, some of these children know the rest of that story, because so often we truncate it and we only want to tell one part of it, and we worry that children can't handle the rest of the story. But believe me, my friends, children live in this world. They do. It's usually us, we're trying to shelter ourselves from the hardships of life. And so we try to shield children's ears. They already know. They already understand the difficulty. It got really messy. Herod's order to kill the children of Bethlehem, we don't really know. We have contemporary historians, by the way, who were writing histories at the same time in the first century. We don't really know if Herod's order to kill the children was actually ever carried out. There's no evidence of it that it was carried out. But it was certainly given. It was an edict that was sent out into the environment of the Jewish community that their king, the one who was leading their nation, and by the way, Herod by this time was a very popular king. The economy was doing very well under Herod. There was employment. There was all kinds of good things that were happening. And so what often happens is that when a leader who has somewhat anxious anxiety inside of themselves is popular in a community, they can make all kinds of outrageous demands, and sometimes because of their popularity and the promise that through them the nation will survive, that people will do bizarre things. So it is possible that the execution happened. One of the other gospel writers quotes an Old Testament text and says that after Herod made this order of execution to kill all of the children in that town of his own nation, of his own people, there was weeping that could be heard among the mountains and the valleys around Ramah. Things got very messy. Very messy. And they didn't get better. There's something important, I think, here. Many, many things important. Parts of this story that I just love. Joseph is an underplayed character in the story of the birth of Jesus. I get it. He's not attributed to being the biological father of Jesus. But I want to tell you, if you're an adopted child and you have a father like Joseph, you are one lucky human being. This man was amazing. He owned Jesus like his very own. He gave up his place, he gave up his status in life to protect Mary and the child. He risked his own shame, saying in some ways, this is not my child, but this is my child. And what I like about this story is we brought it out in the nativity pageant, and I always like to see that we'll have someone sitting there playing Joseph, and then we have an angel who stands next to Joseph and tells Joseph amazing things like, don't worry, it's not your child, but we want you to take care of Mary. and the child. And what I like is the scripture gives ideas that the angel whispered it to Joseph in a dream. 4 times in Joseph's life in this story, an angel whispered to Joseph. And when the angel whispered to him, he protected Mary. When the angel whispered to him that he should be afraid of Herod, he followed the whispering of angels. Now I want to say to you that in the journey of life, as a pastor and as sometimes a counselor, I want to encourage you always to pay attention to what gets whispered to you in your dreams. Pay attention to what gets whispered to you in your dreams. However, as a word of caution from the story itself, I think you ought to know there are certain things that if you hear these whispers, you can be pretty sure they did not come from God. For example, I don't know who was whispering in Herod's ear. I don't know who convinced Herod that the future of their nation and that the survival and the strength of their country would somehow be strengthened by the murder or the abuse of vulnerable children. I don't know who whispered that into Herod's ear, but I'm going to tell you, I know it wasn't God. In fact, I'm going to go as far as to say God has never whispered such things in human beings' ears. There is this thing among leaders, and it's true. I'm sorry to say I'm a full patriot and I love America, but I'm afraid that America, along with many nations of the world today and with nations of the world in history, are listening to whispers in their ears which are not coming from God. Somebody whispered into the administration of this nation that the future security of our nation was dependent upon separating little children from their mothers as they attempted to cross borders seeking life and refuge. Somebody whispered into somebody's ear that the best thing to do was to rip the children from their mothers and make them suffer so that it would stop the immigration of people into this country. That's the logic behind it, because our country may or may not be suffering from immigration. That's the political question. But my challenge to you is to say, we must be careful and learn the lesson from Herod. Herod was the king of the Jews. He was the king of the people of God. And in his insecurity, he began to believe that somehow the strength of their nation and of their survival depended upon the abuse of vulnerable children. Pretty confident that God did not whisper that into Herod's ear or any world leader's ear. You'll hear it. You'll hear world leaders from large nations around the world who will come up with all kinds of ideas, especially the very powerful leaders, individuals who are powerful, who believe that somehow they are the chosen people to lead their nation. And you need to listen very carefully to what gets whispered into their ears about how their nation will survive. Because when the whispering comes from their insecurity, you can trust that somebody, somewhere, is going to be abused. And eventually, they'll work it around to tell you that it was kind of God's idea. Violence against children is never whispered into a person's ear. Not a world leader or a leader of a family. By any measure, if it's in a dream, it didn't come from God. You cannot be Herod, God's chosen leader, and commit acts of violence against the weakest and most vulnerable members of your society. You cannot be a representative of God and carry out the plan for your future by building your future on the backs of the vulnerable. God never whispered in anybody's ear in the world we live in that economic solutions in the world would come from cutting food stamps to poor children who live in urban communities. God never whispered that. God God never whispered to make life harder on the children of Puerto Rico because their parents didn't behave right in the following of the disasters that came upon Puerto Rico after the violent storms. God never whispered, never will whisper that the future of any country will be better, stronger by cutting medical benefits to elderly people, to the mentally ill, and to those who are vulnerable and cannot stand up for themselves. These are the machinations of crazy human beings who believe that somehow their security and their strength depends upon preying upon people who cannot defend themselves. Herod, in fact, was listening to no one except his own internal fears. Following his fears, acting out his insecurity and his vain self-promotion. He becomes the embodiment. Just think about this story as Hebrew people, as Jewish people have read it. The worst political leader they ever had in their long history was Pharaoh in Egypt. The Pharaoh who enslaved these people for hundreds of years and used them to produce a good economy in Egypt. That's what they were. They were the means for creating a good economy. Pharaoh was the hated, stereotypical, worst possible leader the world had ever seen. And the night of Bethlehem, Herod, their own king, became worse than Pharaoh. It was hard for them to put it together. They couldn't imagine how we, the people of God, had somehow ended up with a king, a leader, who would be so antithetical to the concerns of God in the world for all people. And what makes it even stranger in the story is, do you know, where did you hear the young man tell you where Mary and Joseph went for refuge and for protection? They went to Egypt. They went to Egypt. It's part of the development of our human story, not just today and not just yesterday, but study history. People who arise as leaders in the world, nations that arise as strong leaders, promising to bring good and to bring justice into the world. When their fears take over them, they begin to stop listening to the whisperings of God about the importance of welcoming the vulnerable, about caring for injustice in the world, about stop thinking about their own survival first and thinking about the importance of things that are important to God. And when they do, they become their own worst enemy. They become the one they feared the most. Now they are. Joseph was listening to the whispers of God, and he does the unthinkable. The unthinkable acts of mercy, of grace, self-sacrifice. He flees his own country. He flees the laws of his own country. He goes to Egypt, the land he was taught to fear, and he saves the life of Jesus. I hope that in the coming of this new year, that in the sleeping nights of the leaders of the world, they will dream dreams. And I hope that their ears will be open to the whispering of the God who whispered into Joseph's ear. I hope that their ears will be stopped and that their dreams will be blocked as being driven by the insecurities of all of our struggle to survive. My hope is that for all of us, in these nights, these 12 days of Christmas, that we might, before we lay down to sleep, ask God to whisper into our ears, to help us to dream dreams, dreams of protection, of care for the vulnerable, of standing up for those treated unjustly, whisperings of comfort for our brokenness and for our grief. When it gets really messy, and it does, is the best time to listen to the whispers of God who loves the world. Amen. As God would have it, I've been offering my time to help two congregations, one that exists in Patterson and one in Jersey City. Both of these congregations are predominantly African American. And it's been a great journey for me to become more and more a part of the world of people that my world separates only by a couple of miles, but somehow my life has never really traveled in those circles. 2 weeks ago, one of the members of the church in Jersey City said to me, Pastor Lou, you need to rethink a little bit of what New Year's Day is like for you. And I said, really, why so? And he said, well, it's a long time ago, but it's not forgotten. In the African American community in the United States, they remember that New Year's Day was the slave trading day. It was a day where slave owners who had too many slaves or whose mothers had had children, and they're grown now to the point where they could be sold, the buying and the selling always took place on the first day of New Year's. The coming of New Year's was a time of great dread, especially for mothers, who worried that their families would not be kept together. And slave traders often saw to it that mothers never knew where their children were taken. Now, I tell you that story only because I keep asking God to whisper into my ear, especially as I go to prayer, that God would whisper into my ear more of what the human experience is like, so that I'm not the only definer of my prayers, but that my prayers would be able to take me to places and to appeal to God for a world that is more compassionate and a world that is full of love. That God will hear the cries not only of me and of my world, but God will hear the cries of people around the world. People in China, you've seen the stories I know of the enormous number of people who are now being imprisoned in concentration camps in China. And their only reason for being imprisoned is they refuse to give in to the government's control of their religious beliefs. Torture. Beaten. This is a reality not just in the past, but it's a reality in our world today. I almost feel like God is knocking on my door to hear. I have a good friend that was an elder in the Presbyterian church in Milburn. He was a lawyer, and he took up the cause of getting very involved in trying to stop human slavery in the United States for sex. And when he first talked about it, I thought, that must be a really small problem. And as we have remained friends, I have learned, and I don't want to learn. I don't want to know. But I'm just thinking that as we are here on this last Sunday before this year ends, perhaps today, along with other days in your life, We might make our prayers about things that you and I don't even want to think about. Conditions that exist in people's lives, and know that the God of the universe is present and waiting for us to participate in growing in knowledge of what people's experience is like, and then being responsible to say, that's not from God. Let our prayers then join us together with the prayers of people of the world. People struggling in prisons unjustly accused. People whose punishments were outrageous compared to their crimes. People whose governments seem to just disregard them as human beings. Let this day, when we remember the pilgrimage of Mary and Joseph and Jesus at the beginning of his life, bond us and connect us so that we will open our ears and at least learn what is happening in the world. Will you join me? I'll offer some words of prayer, and then we'll sing these refrains. First, Lord, hear my prayer, and then I'll pray a little more, and we'll pray together, and then we'll say and sing together, Lord, hear my song. Lord of all people everywhere, Lord of the universe and of the balance of nature, Lord of the seas and of the skies and of the birds that sing and the birds that are disappearing. You are the Lord of bounty, of economic prosperity, and the Lord of justice. Your arms are large enough to reach and shepherd the whole universe. But our industry and our energy to resist you as a shepherd is huge. All we like sheep want to wander astray. Come, O Lord, gather us up. Help us to see in the struggle of our neighbors, our own struggle. Help to quell our fears about our survival. And help us to lean on you in ways so that our prayers, yes, will be for our friends and the diseases and the struggle that we have, but that we will see our prayers join together with the people of the earth, of all nations and of every language, of every time and place, as we cry out to you from this broken world. Come, be among us. Take up your place, O God. Bring justice and peace and healing and hope. We ask that you hear these prayers as our prayers for our neighbors that are feeling lonely, and for people who are complete strangers to us, who we know are struggling in far-off places. Let our prayers be as large as the world today. Let our prayers be full of courage and confidence. Open us, O God, to both the hardship of life and to the wonder and power of your love. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. O Lord, hear my prayer. O Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me. Oh Lord, the world is full of hardship and difficulty, and it's hard enough. So we ask that you whisper into the ears of teachers and leaders, of pastors, of government workers, and elected political leaders. Whisper loud enough, O God, that they will hear you speaking to them. Speak to them again the words of life and survival and of good living. Calm and quell their fears that the weak and the vulnerable are the threat to them. Lord, whisper loud enough. If you need to, then shout into our ears so that we might hear your voice. You You are the shepherd of the sheep, and you said that we will hear and recognize your voice when you call to us. Allow us to hear your voice and then retune us, O God, with confidence in you for our future. And then a heart of compassion and care for those around us. Teach us to sing a new song, a song of hope and of prayer. Oh Lord is my song, the Lord is my praise. All my hope comes from God. The Lord is my song, the Lord is my praise. God, the strength of God. Let us pray the prayer that the church prays around the world. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I want to thank you for your responses throughout the year to the variety of asks that we as a community have had. As you know, we took a big step out in creating a ministry for people who cannot afford childcare so that they can go to work and support their families. The pictures of our Up Out of the Ground project are there on the back board. And the extension that we took as we borrowed a tremendous amount of money to launch this ministry, and then found out in a way we hadn't borrowed enough. And then we asked you, and many of you in amazing ways stepped up with great gifts of support for the church to sustain its life in this stretch period until the school is up and running. And I want to say to you personally, from me, thank you. Thank you for those of you who paid your pledges up in advance. Thank you to those of you who paid next year's pledge in advance. Thank you to those who dug deep in your pockets and just made checks of gifts to respond to this crisis. I always feel like I know how to tell you when we need it, but I sometimes forget to tell you to thank you when you gave it. And you have given it. I also want to thank you on behalf of the Missions Committee for the way that you have helped us to not only respond to the needs we have in the church, but the needs of the food pantries. The food pantries in the area know us because of your generous contributions, and the food that we sent out of this building during this Christmas season and during the other seasons of collection is phenomenal. And your willingness to engage, both those of you that participated in the hot meals that we served for those who are homeless, and for the way you helped us you give money and you support us as we try to engage in fair working labor standards for the Immokalee workers in Florida who pick tomatoes all the time for our fast food restaurants, for the way you helped us by your giving to participate in caring for people in the hospitals, in the nursing homes. The life of a church, when it's healthy, is not just centered on itself, it is centered outward. And it's a joy to be part of a church as a pastor that sees beyond its own walls and then seeks the welfare of the communities in which it is placed. And I am very grateful to be a part of a community like that. A community also where we're in caring for ourselves. We have such wonderful singers and people gifted with musical talents who come to inspire us in the life of worship. And for that also, I am grateful. And to those of you who come every week early, and then you practice, and then you sing, and you play, and you give us your gifts, I sometimes don't thank you enough. I do sometimes go to Regan and tell her that she has no idea what a difference it makes to me as a pastor to be lifted up by the gifts that you give in the sharing of your gifts for the church. This is the time, my friends, as we come to the end of this decade. Now, there's some debate about whether the decade ends now or next year. I'm taking this decade. As we come to the end of this decade and we look back now, I have been here not 10 years, but I've been here 8. And in that period of time, my heart is full of gratitude. Gratitude for you, for those who are here, and also I have to say, as I come to the end of this year, I have spent a significant amount of time grieving those that we have lost. Some of their pictures are there on the board, but it just seems to me unfair, the number of people who believed and dreamed about this church, but they're not with us right now. And I carry them in my heart. I know many of you do as well. All of this to say to you, my hope is that we will richly be blessed by what has been passed, and that we will hold on to that as we look into the future of where God is leading us. And that you will continue to be the kind of people that you are. Generous, caring about each other and about people beyond the walls of this community. Let us continue to worship God through the giving from our lives, prayers and gifts and money and works of our hands. Let us continue worshiping the living, loving God, even now as we receive an offering this morning for God's work in the world. And I don't know if there are ushers who are chosen today. If a couple of people who know how to do it could just jump up and grab the plates. Okay, I think I see 4 people moving to the task. So, God is good, right? Fills the gap. Thank you. Let us worship God.
This is a new Christmas morning.
winds of wonder and peace and love into your ears. And may it move beyond what you hear in your sleep at night to actions of faith and love in the world in which we live. May God bless you and keep you. May God bless and keep everyone that you know and love. May God bless and keep the world today and every day. May God add God's blessing to our living, so that by being a blessing and living into this world, we may know the truth of God's peace and love for all people. Amen.